The chamber doors sealed behind me before I even reached my seat, and every eye in that vast circular hall turned toward the only human in the room. 400 delegates, 400 pairs of eyes, or sensors, or whatever each species used to see, and every single one of them was waiting for me to raise my hand. I did not raise it. The silence that followed was not confusion. It was something colder. I could see it in the way the elder from the Vorkesh delegation folded his long fingers together, the way the Ithacan ambassador beside him dimmed the soft light that usually glowed beneath her skin. They had heard stories about my species. Now they wanted to know, in this one small motion, whether the stories were true. The vote was supposed to be simple. Sign the Concord of Stillness. Agree that no fleet would ever expand beyond its current borders. Agree that no new colony would ever be founded without permission from the Assembly. Agree that humanity, along with every other species in this hall, would live under a peace so total that nothing would ever change again. 3,000 years of quiet. That was what they were offering. I stood up slowly, and my chair made a small sound against the polished floor that seemed impossibly loud in that silence. I need everyone here to understand something, I said, and my voice carried through the translation field to every corner of the chamber. My people did not travel across the dark between stars so we could stop moving the moment we arrive. The Vorkesh elder tilted his head. His name was Kalinar, and he had chaired this assembly for longer than most species in this room had possessed spaceflight. "You misunderstand the offer, representative," he said, his voice deep and slow, each word placed with care. "We are not asking your people to stop existing. We are asking you to stop causing harm." "Peace built on submission is not peace," I said. "It is a leash with better lighting." A ripple moved through the chamber, not anger, something closer to alarm. The Ithacan ambassador, Selenia, raised one hand, and the light beneath her skin flickered back to a soft gold. 3,000 years without a single war, Representative Cole. 3,000 years without a single species being erased from the stars. You call this a leash? I looked at her, and I tried to keep my voice gentle, because I did not want her to think I was dismissing what her people had built. "I call it a cage with very good intentions," I said, "and I understand why you built it. I have read what happened before the Concord. I have seen the records of the machine wars, the consuming plague, the day the signal from Kepler 9 went silent and never returned. I understand why your ancestors decided that stillness was safer than growth. Then you understand why we ask this of you," Kalinar said. "I understand why you are afraid," I said, "but my people did not survive our own history by lying down every time things became difficult. We survived because we kept moving, we kept building, we kept disagreeing with each other, loudly, publicly, and often, until we found something better. If you take that away from us, you are not offering us peace. You are asking us to stop being what we are." The chamber fell quiet again, and this time the quiet stretched long enough that I could hear the faint hum of the translation field working somewhere above my head. Kalinar leaned forward. "Then you refuse to sign." "I refuse to sign," I said. Someone in the back of the chamber, one of the smaller delegations near the edge of the hall, made a sound that might have been a gasp, or might have been something in their own language that had no equivalent in mine. I could not tell. What I could tell was that word of this moment would travel far beyond these walls before the day was finished. Kalinar called for a recess. The great doors opened, and delegates began filing out in small clusters, whispering to each other in languages that shifted and blurred through the translation field until they became a soft wave of sound that followed me all the way down the corridor. I did not go with them. I stood near the tall windows that looked out over the orbital ring, watching the slow turn of stars outside, and I let myself breathe for the first time since the doors had opened that morning. A voice spoke behind me. "You understand what you have just done." I turned. It was Selenia, the Ithacan ambassador, standing a respectful distance away, with her hands folded in front of her. "I have made myself very unpopular," I said. "You have made humanity a question mark," she said. "For 3,000 years, every species in this assembly has known exactly what to expect from each other. Now no one knows what to expect from you. Is that so terrible?" She studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable beneath the soft glow of her skin. "I do not know yet," she said. "That is what worries me." She left, and I stood there alone with the stars, thinking about everything that had brought me to this room. Somewhere far below the orbital ring, Earth was turning through its ordinary day, unaware that the choice I had just made would ripple outward across 100,000 systems before the week was finished. I thought about my grandmother, who used to tell me that peace worth having was peace you chose every single day, not peace that was handed to you by someone who had already decided the shape of your life. I thought about the long, difficult road that had brought humanity from a single fragile world to a seat at this assembly table. A road built not on stillness, but on struggle, on disagreement, on the stubborn refusal to accept that things could not get better. I thought about the version of humanity that might exist 3,000 years from now if I signed that treaty. A species that had stopped asking questions. A species that had stopped reaching. A species that had traded its future for the comfort of never being surprised again. I could not sign that. Whatever came next, I could not sign that. Behind me, the doors opened again, and an aide stepped through, her uniform marked with the pale blue emblem of the Assembly's administrative wing. "Representative Cole," she said, "the Council of Elders would like to speak with you privately." I turned away from the window and followed her back into the heart of the station, not knowing yet that this single refusal, this one quiet moment of standing still while the rest of the room wanted me to bend, was about to set something in motion that no one, not even the Vorkesh elders who had ruled this assembly for longer than human civilization had existed, would be able to stop. The private chamber was smaller than the main hall, round like the larger room but intimate, built for conversations rather than declarations. Kalinar was already seated when I arrived, along with two other elders I did not recognize, their forms shifting slightly under robes that seemed to be woven from something like woven light. "Sit, please," Kalinar said. I sat. "You have read our history," he said. "I want to know if you understand it, truly understand it, or if you have simply memorized the facts. Tell me what I am missing," I said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he began to speak, and his voice carried a weight that made the room feel smaller. "Before the Concord, this galaxy was not peaceful the way you imagine chaos to be peaceful in your stories," he said. "It was not simply loud, or messy, or full of disagreement. It was a place where entire species vanished within a single generation, where one miscalculation, one moment of pride, could erase 1 billion lives before anyone had time to reconsider. The machine wars alone consumed 12 worlds before the survivors even understood what they were fighting. We built the Concord not because we feared disagreement, Representative Cole. We built it because we had seen what disagreement becomes when it is allowed to grow without limits." I listened to every word, and I let it settle before I answered. "I am not asking you to abandon caution," I said. "I am asking you to understand that caution and stillness are not the same thing. My people have faced our own version of what you are describing. We have buried more of our history in conflict and loss than I would ever want to repeat. But we did not solve that problem by refusing to move forward. We solved it by learning, slowly, painfully, generation after generation, how to disagree without destroying each other. That lesson is still unfinished. It will probably always be unfinished, but it is a living thing, and living things need room to keep changing." One of the other elders, a quiet presence wrapped in silver robes, spoke for the first time. "And if your people fail to learn that lesson in time, if your unfinished experiment becomes another machine war, another Kepler-9, this time on our doorstep, then you will have every right to say you tried to warn us," I said. "But you do not get to make that choice for us in advance. Not because we are certain we are right, because certainty is not the point. The point is that a species that is never allowed to risk failure is a species that has already failed, quietly, without anyone noticing. The room was silent again, and I could feel the weight of 3 ancient minds turning my words over, testing them the way a jeweler tests a stone for flaws. Kalinar finally spoke. "You are either the bravest representative to sit in that chair in 3,000 years, he said, or the most dangerous." "Perhaps I am both," I said. "Perhaps every species that has ever mattered in this galaxy was both, once, before it decided to stop being either." He studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, though I could not tell if it was respect or worry, or some combination of the two that his species did not have a word for. "The assembly will reconvene in 3 days, he said finally. "You have given yourself, and your species, a great deal to answer for before then." I nodded, rose from my seat, and walked out of that chamber knowing that whatever happened next, there was no version of the coming days that would be quiet. And somewhere deep inside me, beneath the exhaustion and the weight of what I had just done, there was a small, steady flame of certainty that told me I had made exactly the right choice, even if I was the only one in the galaxy who believed it yet. 3 days. That was all the time I had before the assembly would gather again and demand an answer that I had already given. I intended to use every hour of it. Word of my refusal had already begun spreading before I reached the transport that would carry me back to my quarters on the outer ring of the station. I could see it in the way other delegates watched me from across the corridor, in the way conversations paused when I passed, then resumed in careful whispers once they thought I was out of earshot. I did not mind the attention. I had expected it the moment I chose to stand instead of sign. What I had not expected was the message waiting for me when I finally reached my quarters, a simple text notice from an unfamiliar address, requesting a meeting the following morning with someone who introduced herself only as a historian of the Assembly's Archive Division. I read the message twice, then set it aside, and allowed myself, finally, to rest. Tomorrow would bring its own difficulties. Tonight, I only wanted to remember why I had chosen this path in the first place, and to make certain that when morning came, I would still have the strength to walk it. The historian's name was Claire Bennett, and she was waiting for me outside the archive wing when I arrived the next morning, dressed in the plain gray robes that marked members of the Assembly's Research Division. She was human, which surprised me, since very few humans held positions within the Assembly's administrative structure this early in our membership. "Representative Cole," she said, extending a hand, "thank you for agreeing to meet me." "You said this was important," I said, shaking her hand. "I think it might be the most important conversation you have this week," she said. "Walk with me." She led me through a set of tall doors into a chamber lined with data archives, stretching up into a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow. Here, she told me, was where the Assembly kept the full record of everything that had happened before the Concord, and everything that had happened in the 3,000 years since. "I have spent the last decade studying these records," she said, "and I want to show you something before the Council tries to convince you that your refusal was a mistake." She gestured, and a soft light filled the space between us, revealing images and records that had clearly not been shared widely, images of worlds that had thrived quietly under the Concord for centuries, and others that had withered in ways no one liked to speak about. "The peace is real," she said. "I want you to understand that first. No wars have been fought, no species has been destroyed. That part of the story is completely true." "But," I said. She turned to look at me, and there was something tired in her eyes, the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent years learning something they wished they did not know. "But stillness has a cost too," she said. "It is simply a quieter cost, one that takes centuries to become visible instead of days. Species that stop reaching for anything new eventually stop reaching at all. I have watched 3 civilizations in these records slowly forget how to dream past the borders they were given. Not because anyone forced them to stop. Because after enough generations of being told that stillness was safety, they simply stopped wanting anything else. I felt something settle in my chest, a confirmation of the fear that had driven my refusal in the first place, though I had not expected to hear it spoken so plainly, and so soon. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you are the first representative in 3,000 years who refused to sign," she said. "And because I think, somewhere in this archive, there is proof that you were right to refuse. I just have not been permitted to share it until now." She looked at me, and for the first time since I had entered that chamber, I saw something like hope in her expression. "Will you help me find it?" she asked. I told her yes, before I had even finished thinking through what it might cost me. Claire led me deeper into the archive, past rows of storage units that hummed with a low, steady frequency, until we reached a section marked with symbols I did not recognize, sealed behind a barrier that required her personal authorization to open. "This section holds records that were never shared with the wider assembly," she said, placing her palm against the scanner. "Records the council decided were too dangerous for general knowledge." The barrier dissolved, and she stepped through, gesturing for me to follow. Inside, the chamber was smaller, quieter, lit by a soft blue light that seemed to come from nowhere in particular. Data streams floated in the air around us, tagged with names of worlds I had never heard mentioned in any official record. "These are the species who accepted the Concord fully," Claire said. "Not just the treaty, but the philosophy behind it. They stopped building new ships. They stopped exploring beyond their own systems. They stopped asking difficult questions about their own governments, because difficult questions lead to disagreement, and disagreement was exactly what the Concord was designed to prevent." She pulled one record forward, and an image appeared, a world called Osara, its surface a soft green under a pale sun. 3,000 years ago, Osara was one of the most curious species in this quadrant, she said. Their scientists were close to solving problems that even the Vorkesh had not managed. They asked questions about the universe that made the council uncomfortable. "What happened to them?" I asked. "They signed the Concord," she said. "Fully, completely. And over the following centuries, their curiosity simply faded. Not because anyone forced it to fade, because a society that is never allowed to risk failure eventually stops valuing the kind of thinking that leads to failure in the first place. Today, the Osaran homeworld is still there, still peaceful, still exactly as safe as it was 3,000 years ago." She paused, and the image shifted to show the same world in the present day, its cities unchanged, its technology frozen at a level it had reached centuries earlier. "And still exactly as it was 3,000 years ago," she said again, quieter this time. "No growth, no new questions, no new answers, just a very long, very comfortable pause that never ended." I stared at the image, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. This was not the story the Assembly told in its official records. This was not the peaceful, thriving galaxy that Kalinar and the other elders described when they spoke of the Concord's success. "Does the Council know you have shown me this?" I asked. "No," Claire said. "And if they find out, I will likely lose my position here. But I have spent 10 years watching species quietly disappear into their own comfort, and I could not stay silent while your species walked toward the same fate without at least knowing what it might cost you. Why does this matter so much to you?" I asked. "You are human too. You could have stayed on Earth, lived a quiet life, never thought twice about any of this." She was quiet for a long moment before she answered. "My grandfather was part of the first generation to leave Earth," she said. "He used to tell me that humanity's greatest strength was not our intelligence, or our technology, or even our stubbornness. It was our refusal to ever be finished. He said the day humanity decided it had learned enough, built enough, become enough, would be the day we truly began to die, even if our bodies kept breathing for centuries afterward. I thought about my own grandmother, about the conversations that had shaped the person standing in this chamber, and I understood, in that moment, that Claire and I had been given the same lesson by two very different people, separated by decades and distance, and that lesson had brought us both to this exact place. "There is more," Claire said, and she pulled another record forward, this one showing a different world, this one darker, its cities half abandoned. "This is Thren," she said. "Their story went differently. They signed the Concord, but a faction within their government refused to accept the terms of stillness fully. They kept researching in secret, kept building in secret. For 300 years, they lived a double life, publicly compliant, privately still reaching for something more. What happened to them?" "The council discovered what they were doing," Claire said, "and the punishment was not violence. It did not need to be. The council simply withdrew all support, all trade, all connection to the rest of the assembly. Thren was left alone, cut off from every resource that had sustained its growth for centuries. Within 2 generations, the world that dared to keep questioning collapsed under the weight of its own isolation. I felt the full shape of the choice in front of me now, clearer than it had been in the assembly chamber the day before. This was not simply a question of signing a treaty or refusing it. This was a question of what kind of pressure the assembly was willing to apply to any species that chose growth over stillness, and how far that pressure could reach. "Why show me both of these?" I asked. "The world that faded quietly, and the world that was punished for refusing to fade? Because I want you to understand exactly what you are walking into," Claire said. "The council will not threaten you directly. They are too careful, too patient for something so obvious. But they have other ways of applying pressure, and I have watched those methods work on species far stronger than yours. You think humanity cannot withstand that kind of pressure? I think humanity has never faced this particular kind of pressure before," she said. "Every difficulty your species has overcome in its history was a difficulty you could see, something you could push against directly. This is different. This is a slow, quiet erosion disguised as kindness, offered with genuine good intentions by people who truly believe they are saving you from yourselves." I stood in that chamber for a long time, surrounded by the floating records of worlds that had chosen stillness, willingly or otherwise, and I thought about every version of humanity's future that might unfold from this single moment. "Thank you for showing me this," I said finally. "I needed to understand what I am asking my people to face." "There is one more thing," Claire said, and something in her voice shifted, became more careful. "I did not only bring you here to warn you. I brought you here because I believe there is a path forward that the Council has never considered, because no species has ever been stubborn enough to attempt it." "What path?" "Every species that has faced this pressure before either surrendered fully, like Osara, or resisted alone, in secret, like Thren," she said. "No one has ever refused publicly, in front of the entire assembly, the way you did yesterday. No one has ever forced this conversation into the open before deciding how to answer it. You think that changes something?" "I think the Council has spent 3,000 years perfecting a system for quietly convincing species to accept stillness," she said. "They have never had to defend that system in the open, in front of every delegation in this assembly, against someone who refuses to be quiet about what they are seeing. That is not a situation they have practiced for, and species that have never practiced for something tend to make mistakes when they finally face it." I felt something shift inside me, a small spark of possibility where before there had only been the weight of an impossible choice. "You want me to keep pushing," I said, "publicly, in front of everyone." "I want you to understand what you are already doing," she said. "You lit a fire yesterday, without fully realizing it. I am simply telling you not to let anyone convince you to put it out." We stood together in that quiet chamber for a while longer, the floating records slowly dimming around us as the archive systems returned them to storage, and I found myself grateful, more grateful than I could easily express, that this one historian had decided the truth mattered more than her own safety within the assembly. "There is a meeting scheduled for tomorrow," I told her, "a smaller gathering, before the full assembly reconvenes. The council wants to speak with me again, privately, to see if 3 days of reflection have softened my position." "They will try to make you feel isolated," Claire said. "They will remind you how few species have ever stood where you are standing, how much easier this would be if you simply agreed." "I know," I said. "Do you still intend to refuse?" I thought about Osara, quiet and unchanging under its pale sun. I thought about Thren, abandoned and collapsing under the weight of its own isolation. I thought about my grandmother's voice, telling me that peace worth having was peace you chose every day, not peace handed down by someone who had already decided the shape of your future. "Yes," I said, "I still intend to refuse." Claire smiled, small and tired but genuine. "Then I suggest you get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow will not be easy." She was right, though neither of us could have known just how difficult the following days would become, or how quickly the quiet pressure Claire had described would begin to take a very different shape, one that neither of us had fully anticipated when we stood together in that archive, surrounded by the ghosts of worlds that had chosen to stop reaching for anything beyond the safety of stillness. I left the archive that evening with a heavier understanding of what lay ahead, but also with something I had not expected to find there, a sense that I was not entirely alone in this, that somewhere within the vast, careful structure of the assembly there were others who believed, as I did, that a peace built on forgetting was not a peace worth keeping. I returned to my quarters and sat for a long time by the window, watching the slow turn of the station against the endless field of stars, and I thought about all the worlds Claire had shown me, and all the worlds still ahead of us, still undecided, still waiting to see what kind of choice humanity would make. Tomorrow, the council would try again to convince me that stillness was safety, and tomorrow I intended to remind them, calmly and clearly, that safety without growth was simply another word for slowly disappearing. The message arrived while I was still asleep, and it was Oliver Grant, the officer stationed at the communications post nearest my quarters, who woke me with the kind of urgency that told me something had already gone wrong before I had even opened my eyes. "Representative Cole," he said through the door panel, "you need to see this immediately." I dressed quickly and followed him down the corridor to the small operations room that monitored traffic near the human transport fleet stationed just beyond the assembly's outer boundary. On the main display, a formation of ships had appeared at the edge of our sensor range, arranged in a pattern that I did not need a military background to recognize as deliberate, careful, and designed to be seen. 91 vessels, Oliver said. They appeared at the boundary 2 hours ago. No communication yet, no hostile posture, but they are not moving either. I stared at the formation, spread wide across the display, like a slow, patient wall drawn across the space between the assembly station and the rest of human territory. "Whose fleet is this?" I asked. "Unconfirmed," Oliver said, "but the ship design matches records from 3 different council-aligned species. This looks coordinated." I felt the weight of Claire's warning settle over me fully for the first time. This was not the quiet, patient pressure she had described. This was something faster, something meant to be felt immediately rather than over the slow course of generations. "Get me a channel to the fleet commander, overseeing our side of the boundary," I said. Within minutes, I was patched through to Henry Dawes, the officer commanding the human vessels stationed nearest the formation. His voice was steady, though I could hear the tension underneath it. "Representative Cole," he said, "we have 91 unidentified vessels holding position at the boundary. They have made no aggressive movements, but their formation is clearly meant to block our usual transit routes." "Do we have enough ships to hold our position?" I asked. "We have enough to make a statement," Henry said. "Not enough to win a direct confrontation if it comes to that. My recommendation is that we withdraw and report this to the assembly through proper channels." I thought about Thren, isolated and abandoned after daring to keep questioning the Concorde in private. I thought about how quickly quiet pressure could shift into something more direct the moment a species showed any sign of true resistance. "No," I said. "We hold position. Power all systems, but do not fire first under any circumstance. This is not a fight we start. If it becomes one, it will be because they chose it, not because we did." There was a pause on the other end of the channel. "Understood," Henry said finally. "Holding position." I stayed in that operations room for the next several hours, watching the standoff unfold in real time, feeling every minute stretch longer than the one before it. Oliver kept a careful log of every movement on both sides, though there was very little to log, since neither formation moved at all. Around midday, station time, Claire arrived, out of breath, having clearly heard the news through channels of her own. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said, watching the display. "They are testing you." "Testing how far I will bend before I finally back down," I said. "Testing whether humanity is willing to hold its ground even when the cost becomes visible instead of theoretical," she said. "Osara never faced anything like this. Their surrender was gradual, generation by generation. Thren faced isolation, not confrontation. This is different. This is the Council deciding that quiet pressure alone might not be enough this time." I thought about that for a long moment, watching the 91 ships hold their silent, patient formation on the display. "Why show force at all?" I said, mostly to myself. "If quiet pressure has worked for 3,000 years, why change the approach now?" "Because you changed the approach first," Claire said. "You refused publicly. You forced this into the open. The Council has never had to respond to open resistance before, and I do not think they fully know how to respond to it either. This formation might be less a plan and more a reaction, something improvised because the old methods were not designed for someone who refuses to be quiet." I found a strange comfort in that thought, even as the tension in the room continued to build around me. If this was improvisation, rather than a carefully designed strategy, then perhaps there was still room to shape how this moment ended. Hour 4 of the standoff arrived, and still neither formation had moved. I ordered food brought to the operations room, insisted that Oliver and the rest of the monitoring team rotate through short breaks, and refused every suggestion that I should rest myself. "You need to stay sharp," Claire said quietly, sitting beside me as the display continued its silent count of hours. "Exhausted decisions are rarely good decisions." "I will rest when this is resolved," I said. Hour 5 brought the first sign of movement, though not from the alien formation. A single vessel detached from the human fleet, moving forward alone, and my heart dropped as I recognized the ship's designation on the display. "That is not authorized," I said sharply into the comm channel. "Henry, who ordered that ship forward?" "Unauthorized movement," Henry's voice came back, tense. "One of our pilots broke formation. We are trying to reach him now." I watched the small icon on the display drift closer to the alien formation, and I felt every second stretch into something unbearable, knowing that a single reckless decision by one frightened pilot could undo everything I had tried to build over the past 2 days. "Get him back," I said. "Now." "Working on it," Henry said. "He is not responding to hails." The pilot's ship continued forward, and across the boundary, several vessels within the alien formation shifted position, adjusting to the new movement, though still without any sign of aggression. I understood, in that moment, exactly how quickly this entire careful standoff could collapse into something far worse, not through any decision made by the Council or by me, but through the simple, human fear of a single person who had reached the edge of what he could tolerate. "This is Cole," I said, opening a direct channel to the drifting ship, my voice as calm and steady as I could force it to be. "Whatever you are feeling right now, I understand it, but I need you to stop and listen to me for just a moment." Silence answered me, though I could see on the display that the ship had, at least, stopped its forward drift. My name is Nathan Cole, I continued. I do not know your name, but I know you are frightened, and I know that fear is asking you to do something right now that feels like protection. I am asking you to trust me instead. Turn your ship around. Come back to formation. Let me carry the weight of this decision, because that is what I am here for. Another long silence, and then, finally, a voice, young, unsteady. I just wanted to protect everyone, he said. I thought if I moved first, showed them we were not afraid, they might back down. I understand, I said, but moving first is exactly what they are hoping one of us will do. It gives them a reason to respond the way they have been trained to respond for 3,000 years. Come back, please. Let us win this the harder way, the way that actually matters. There was a pause, and then the small icon on the display began to drift backward, slowly returning toward the human formation, and I felt the tension in my chest ease slightly, though the larger standoff remained unresolved. Thank you, Henry said quietly over the channel. That could have ended very differently. It still might, I said, watching the alien formation settle back into its original, patient stillness. This is not over yet. Hour 6 brought a change, though not the one I expected. A single vessel from the alien formation moved forward, slow and deliberate, and opened a direct channel to my position rather than to the fleet. Representative Cole, a voice said, translated smoothly through the same system that had carried every conversation I'd had since arriving at the assembly. This is Fleet Commander Vesserin, acting under Council authorization. Commander, I said. Your formation has been holding our transit routes for 6 hours without explanation. We were ordered to demonstrate the seriousness of the Council's position, Vesserin said, and there was something in the translated tone that almost sounded like discomfort. To remind your people of the consequences of continued refusal. And has the demonstration worked? I asked. There was a pause before he answered. I do not know, he said finally. In 3,000 years, I have never held a formation this long without some response from the other side. Every other species we have positioned against eventually withdrew, or fired, or signaled surrender. Your fleet has done none of these things. We are not going to fire first, I said, and we are not going to withdraw either. We are simply going to wait, exactly as long as it takes, until your council decides what kind of galaxy it actually wants to be part of. Another pause, longer this time. I did not choose this assignment, Representative, Vesserin said quietly. I have spent my entire career enforcing the Concord's peace, and I believed, truly believed, that I was protecting lives by doing so. Watching your fleet hold this line for 6 hours without a single provocation has made me question something I have never questioned before. What is that? I asked. Whether peace enforced through fear was ever truly peace at all, he said, or whether we simply gave it that name because the alternative was too difficult to face. I did not answer immediately, letting his words settle in the quiet of the operations room. I cannot promise you an easy answer to that question, Commander, I said finally. I am still finding my own answer to it, one day at a time. Perhaps that is the only honest way to find it, Vesserin said. Moments later, the alien formation began to withdraw, slowly, deliberately, the same careful precision with which it had arrived, until the boundary between our territories stood empty once more, the stars shining quietly through the space where 91 ships had held their patient, silent watch for 6 long hours. The operations room erupted into quiet, exhausted relief, and I finally allowed myself to sit back in my chair, feeling the full weight of the day settle into my shoulders. You did it, Claire said, watching the display return to its ordinary, peaceful readings. You actually did it. We did it, I said, glancing toward Henry's channel, toward Oliver, still monitoring the boundary, toward the young pilot who had almost broken everything and then found the strength to turn back. All of us. But even as the relief washed over the room, I understood that this was not an ending. It was simply the first true test of a much longer struggle, one that had only just begun to reveal how far the Council was willing to go, and how much further humanity would need to be willing to stand its ground before anything truly changed. Word of the standoff spread through the assembly faster than any official announcement could contain it, and by the time the sun rose over the station the following morning, I understood that the quiet, careful world I had entered 3 days ago no longer existed. In its place stood something far less certain, far more dangerous, and, though I could not have said it aloud yet, far more hopeful than anything the Concord of Stillness had ever offered. By the time I returned to the assembly station, the story of the 6-hour standoff had already reached every delegation within its walls, carried not through official channels, but through the kind of quiet, urgent whispering that moves faster than any formal announcement ever could. I noticed the change immediately. Delegates who had avoided my gaze days earlier now watched me openly as I passed, some with open curiosity, others with something closer to caution. Kalinar's summons arrived within an hour of my arrival, requesting my presence before the full council rather than the smaller private chamber I had visited before. Claire walked with me toward the council hall, her expression unusually thoughtful. "They are frightened," she said quietly. "Not of your fleet, of what your fleet's restraint means for everyone else who has been quietly wondering whether the Concord was ever truly a choice, or simply the only option anyone had been shown." "You think this changes things beyond humanity," I said. "I think you have no idea yet how many species have spent centuries wishing someone would refuse loudly enough for the rest of them to finally speak up too," she said. We reached the council hall, and this time the chamber was fuller than before, additional delegations from smaller species standing quietly along the edges of the room, present, I suspected, not because they had been summoned, but because they wanted to witness whatever happened next. Kalinar rose as I entered, his expression carefully neutral, though I had learned enough in the past few days to recognize the tension beneath it. "Representative Cole," he said, "your fleet's actions yesterday have caused considerable concern among several council members." "My fleet did not fire a single shot," I said. "It did not advance. It did not retreat. It simply held its position and waited for your formation to decide what kind of galaxy it wanted to be part of." "You call that restraint," said a delegate I did not recognize, seated near the edge of the council table. "I call it defiance. I call it the only honest response to a formation sent specifically to frighten us into compliance," I said. "If restraint under pressure looks like defiance to this council, then perhaps it is worth asking what this council has grown accustomed to seeing instead." A murmur moved through the gathered delegations, and I could see, along the edges of the room, several of the smaller species exchanging glances that carried more meaning than any translated word could capture. Kalinar raised a hand, calling for quiet, though his gaze remained fixed on me. "You understand the position this places the council in," he said. "For 3,000 years, this assembly has maintained peace through a shared understanding that resistance to the Concord carries consequences. Your fleet's actions yesterday demonstrated, publicly, that those consequences can be withstood." "They can be withstood," I said, "because they were never truly consequences in the first place. They were fear, dressed carefully enough that no one questioned whether it was necessary." "And if every species in this assembly reaches the same conclusion?" Kalinar asked. "If every world begins to question whether the Concord's peace was ever a true agreement, rather than a quiet threat everyone simply learned to live beneath, then perhaps this assembly will finally have the difficult conversation it has been avoiding for 3,000 years, I said. "About what peace actually means, and whether it can survive being questioned honestly." The silence that followed was different from the silence I had felt on my first day in this chamber. That silence had been uncertain, watching to see what kind of species humanity might be. This silence felt heavier, as though something long buried beneath the assembly's careful order had finally been allowed to surface. A new voice broke the quiet, coming from one of the smaller delegations along the edge of the room. The speaker was small, delicate, a representative I recognized from a species called the Fenari, one of the quieter members of the assembly who rarely spoke during council sessions. "Forgive my interruption," the Fenari representative said, her voice soft but carrying clearly through the translation field. "But I have sat in this assembly for 40 years, watching every vote pass unanimously, watching every treaty renew without a single dissenting voice. And I have always wondered whether that unanimous agreement was truly unanimous, or whether every species in this room had simply learned, the same way my people learned, that dissent carried a cost too heavy to risk." Kalinar turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "Representative, this is not the appropriate venue for—" "I believe it is exactly the appropriate venue," she said, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "Because if a species as young as humanity can refuse this council's demands and survive the consequences, then perhaps it is time the rest of us admitted how long we have been afraid to ask the same questions." The murmur that followed was louder this time, spreading through the gathered delegations like a current finally released after being held back for far too long. I watched several other representatives exchange glances, some hesitant, others openly curious, and I understood, in that moment, exactly what Claire had meant when she spoke of species who had been quietly wishing for someone else to speak first. Kalinar called for order, and the chamber gradually settled, though the quality of the silence had changed permanently, carrying now an undercurrent of questions that would not easily be put back to rest. "This council will reconvene in 1 week's time," Kalinar said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that the ground beneath his authority had shifted, even if he was not yet ready to admit how far. "Representative Cole, your position and the position of your species will be formally addressed then, alongside any other delegation who wishes to raise similar concerns." The chamber began to empty, delegates filing out in clusters, far more animated than the careful, measured conversations I had witnessed on my first day. Claire fell into step beside me as we made our way back through the corridors, her expression a careful mixture of hope and concern. "This is bigger than I expected," she said quietly. "I thought it might take years for anyone else to find the courage to speak. I did not expect it to happen in a single council session. Sometimes all it takes is one voice refusing to stay quiet," I said. "The rest simply needed permission they had been waiting for without knowing it." Over the following days, that permission spread further than either of us anticipated. Delegations that had never before questioned the Concord's terms began requesting private meetings, some cautious, testing the waters carefully, others more direct, asking outright whether humanity would be willing to stand alongside them if they, too, chose to refuse the coming renewal. I met with as many as I could, listening to stories that echoed Claire's warnings from the archive, species who had watched their own curiosity slowly fade under centuries of enforced stillness, species who remembered ancestors who had once dreamed of reaching further than the Concord now allowed. Among them was an ambassador from a species called the Doran, whose translated name came through simply as Vaith, who approached me on the 4th day with an offer that surprised me with its boldness. "My people have watched your fleet's restraint with great interest," Vaith said, seated across from me in a small meeting room near the archive wing. "We have wanted to question the Concord for over a century, but we lack the confidence to do so alone. If your species is willing to stand publicly against renewal, mine is prepared to stand beside you. You understand the risk," I said. "The Council may respond to a larger challenge with more than a 6-hour standoff." "We understand," Vaith said, "but I have come to believe that the risk of continued stillness may be greater than the risk of finally challenging it." By the end of that week, 6 delegations, including humanity, had quietly agreed to present a unified refusal when the Council reconvened, a coalition that had not existed a week earlier, born entirely from a single moment of public defiance that no one, least of all myself, could have fully predicted would grow so quickly. Claire found me the evening before the council was set to reconvene, standing once again by the tall windows overlooking the orbital ring, watching the same slow turn of stars that had witnessed the beginning of all of this. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" she asked. "I do not know if anyone could truly be ready for tomorrow," I said, "but I know we are as prepared as 6 species who have never stood together before can be. Kalinar will not simply accept this quietly," she said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, it will change the assembly permanently, one way or another." "I know," I said, watching the stars continue their patient turn. "I think that is exactly why we have to try." The council hall had never held this many delegations at once, not in the 3 days I had spent within these walls, and certainly not, according to Claire, in the many years she had studied the assembly's long, careful history. 6 delegations stood together near the center of the chamber: Human, Doran, Fenari, and 3 others who had joined in the final days before this session, each representative carrying the same quiet resolve I had felt standing alone in this same room barely a week earlier. Kalinar entered last, his expression composed, though I could see, in the careful way he studied the gathered coalition, that he understood exactly how much had changed since our first meeting. "This council convenes to formally address the renewal of the Concord of Stillness," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber with practiced authority. "Representative Cole has requested this session be expanded to include additional voices. I have granted that request, though I remind everyone present that the terms of the Concord have preserved peace across this galaxy for 3,000 years. "With respect, Elder Kalinar," I said, stepping forward, "peace and stillness have never been the same thing, and I believe every delegation standing here today has come to understand that difference in their own way." Vaith stepped forward beside me, his voice steady, despite what I knew must have been considerable nervousness. "My people have lived beneath the Concord for 3 centuries, believing we had no choice but to accept its terms. I have learned, in recent days, that belief was never entirely true." One by one, the other delegations spoke, each offering their own version of the same quiet realization: stories of curiosity dimmed, ambitions set aside, questions never asked because the cost of asking had always seemed too great to risk. The Fenari representative, who had spoken so unexpectedly during our previous session, stepped forward last, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even me. 40 years I sat silently in this chamber," she said. 40 years I told myself that silence was wisdom, that stillness was safety, that the peace we had built was worth whatever quiet sacrifices it required. I no longer believe that. I believe we built a peace so fragile that it could only survive by never being questioned, and I no longer wish to protect something that cannot withstand an honest conversation." Kalinar listened to each voice without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful with every delegation that spoke, until finally, when the chamber fell quiet once more, he rose slowly from his seat. "You believe the Concord has failed," he said, though it was not quite a question. "I believe the Concord succeeded at exactly what it was built to do," I said. "It prevented the kind of catastrophic conflict that nearly destroyed this galaxy 3,000 years ago. That achievement is real, and it deserves recognition. But somewhere along the way, preventing catastrophe became indistinguishable from preventing growth, and I do not believe those 2 things were ever meant to be the same." "Then what do you propose instead?" Kalinar asked. "A return to the chaos that nearly ended us?" "No," I said. "I propose something this assembly has never truly attempted, not stillness and not chaos, but a peace that allows for disagreement, for risk, for the possibility of failure, alongside the possibility of growth. A peace that is chosen freely, again and again, rather than one that is simply inherited and never questioned." Kalinar was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving slowly across the 6 delegations standing together in the center of the chamber. You understand, this would require dismantling 3,000 years of careful structure, he said, rebuilding something that has never existed in this assembly's history. I understand, I said, and I understand it will not be simple, and it will not be without difficulty, but I believe every species in this room deserves the chance to choose their own future, rather than having that future decided for them by a fear that has outlived its original purpose. The council chamber fell into a silence unlike any I had witnessed before, not the tense, uncertain silence of my first day, nor the charged, questioning silence of the previous session, but something quieter, more contemplative, as though the entire weight of 3,000 years of careful order had finally paused to consider whether it might be time for something new. Solenia, the Ithacan ambassador who had questioned me so directly during my first day in this chamber, stepped forward from among the seated delegations, her expression thoughtful. I opposed your refusal when you first spoke against the Concord, she said. I believed you did not understand what you were risking. I still believe the dangers that led to the Concord's creation were real, and I do not believe we should forget them simply because 3,000 years have passed since they nearly destroyed us. I do not ask anyone to forget them, I said. I ask only that we find a way to remember them without allowing that memory to keep us permanently still. Solenia studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, just slightly. Perhaps that is possible, she said. Perhaps it is even necessary, but it will require more courage than simply refusing a single treaty. It will require this entire assembly to relearn how to trust each other without the Concord's rules holding everything in place. Then let us begin relearning, I said. The vote, when it finally came, was unlike any vote the assembly had held in 3,000 years. Not unanimous, not immediate, but real, contested, filled with genuine uncertainty about what the outcome would mean. Delegations that had voted the same way for centuries found themselves divided, some clinging to the safety of the familiar, others reaching, cautiously, toward something they had never been permitted to imagine before. When the final count was read, the Concord of Stillness did not survive its renewal. In its place, the assembly agreed to something far less certain, a framework built not on rigid rules but on shared principles, allowing each species the freedom to grow, to explore, to risk failure in pursuit of something better, while still preserving the hard-won lessons that had prevented catastrophe for 3 millennia. Kalinar remained in his seat long after the chamber had begun to empty, and I approached him quietly, uncertain what to say to someone who had spent his entire long life maintaining a system that had just been fundamentally reshaped. You believe this was the right choice, he said, not quite looking at me. I believe it was the only honest choice, I said. The Concord kept us safe from repeating the past, but it could not keep us safe from slowly disappearing into a future with nothing left to reach for. I think, somewhere in you, you have known that for a long time. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something I had not heard from him before, a kind of tired relief. I have watched this assembly for longer than your entire species has existed, he said. I built my life around the belief that stillness was the only thing standing between us and destruction. It is not easy to admit that belief may have cost us more than it saved. You do not have to admit it all at once, I said. None of us do. This is not an ending, Elder Kalinar. It is simply the beginning of a much longer, much harder conversation, one this assembly has been avoiding for 3,000 years. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since I had met him, something like genuine curiosity crossed his ancient features. Then perhaps it is worth having, he said. In the months that followed, the galaxy did not descend into chaos, as some had feared it might. New trade routes opened between species that had never before dared to reach beyond their own borders. Scientific collaborations formed between worlds that had spent centuries pursuing knowledge in careful isolation. Disagreements arose, sometimes sharply, sometimes painfully, but they were met with negotiation rather than silence, with genuine effort rather than enforced stillness. I stood once more at the window overlooking the orbital ring, watching the slow turn of stars that had witnessed everything from the beginning, and Claire joined me there, carrying 2 cups of something warm that smelled faintly of earth. "Is this the peace you wanted?" she asked, handing me one of the cups. I thought about the question carefully before answering, watching the light of 100 distant systems flicker against the dark. "No," I said finally. "This is not peace the way the Concord defined it. There is no guarantee here, no promise that nothing will ever go wrong again. There will be disagreements, there will be failures, there will be difficult, uncomfortable conversations that no treaty could have prevented." "Then what is it?" she asked. "It is the freedom to face all of that honestly," I said, "instead of pretending it does not exist. It is the chance to choose our future, again and again, rather than having it chosen for us by a fear 3,000 years old." Claire smiled, watching the stars alongside me. "My grandfather would have liked this version of peace," she said quietly. "So would my grandmother," I said. We stood together in comfortable silence, 2 humans among 100,000 systems, watching a galaxy that had spent 3,000 years standing still finally begin, cautiously and imperfectly, to move again. The assembly had wanted peace, the kind that asked for nothing in return but obedience and silence. Humanity had refused that peace, not because we did not value it, but because we understood, more deeply than perhaps any species in that ancient chamber, that peace worth keeping was peace you had to choose freely and defend honestly every single day for as long as the stars continued to turn. And as I stood there, watching the light of new possibilities spreading slowly across a galaxy, finally willing to risk growth again, I understood that this was not the end of humanity's story among the stars. It was only the very beginning.